Welcome to Anews. I'm Umar Taslim and you're watching Turkey's Diplomacy. A U.S.-brokered Armenia-Azerbaijan peace deal is reshaping the South Caucasus as Turkey strengthens ties with Georgia and Trump prepares to meet Putin in Alaska. Today, I'll be discussing the latest regional and international developments with my guests, Anews editor Mustafa Kocakanar and Dr. Şuay Nilhan Açakalın from the Hacı Bayram Veli University in Ankara. We'll also shed light on the latest from the Gaza Strip, where Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu is pushing for full occupation.
Azerbaijan and Armenia signed a U.S.-brokered peace agreement on Friday, marking the formal end to more than 3 decades of hostility and opening the door to expanded diplomatic and economic ties between the South Caucasus neighbors.
It's a long time, 35 years. They fought, and now they're friends, and they're going to be friends for a long time. But it's a big, beautiful honor to welcome everyone to the White House for this very historic peace summit between Armenia and Azerbaijan. It's really a great thrill for me.
Under the terms of the new agreement, both countries pledged to halt hostilities, establish formal diplomatic relations, and respect each other's territorial integrity. The deal also grants the United States exclusive development rights to a strategic transit corridor through the South Caucasus, which Washington says will enhance energy exports and regional trade.
This declaration establishes what they are calling a great honor for me. I didn't ask for this, the Trump route for international peace and prosperity, which is a special transit area that will allow Azerbaijan to get full access to its territory of Nakhchivan while fully respecting Armenia's sovereignty.
The United States signed separate agreements with each country to deepen cooperation in energy, trade, and technology, including artificial intelligence. Washington also lifted restrictions on defense cooperation with Azerbaijan, signaling a shift in its regional security posture.
So who, if not President Trump, deserves the Nobel Peace Prize? I don't want to go into the history of some very strange decisions of the Nobel Peace Committee to award the prize for someone who didn't do anything at all. But President Trump, in 6 months, did a miracle. So I think that my Armenian colleague will support it. And
I want to thank President Trump and his team for brokering this game-changing outcome between Armenia and Azerbaijan. This is a great deal we've achieved today. This is a success for our countries and for our region, and a success for the world, because a more peaceful region means a safer world.
Welcome back to the program. Anews editor Mustafa Kocakanar, welcome to the program.
Good morning, Juan.
Mustafa, let's start with the Caucasus, especially with the recent deal that was signed between Armenia and Azerbaijan and brokered by President Trump. Now, Mustafa, there are some key details from this deal. Now, both of these countries, we've seen the hostilities between the two sides over the past few years. Now, this deal aims to cease hostilities, recognize the borders, and establish diplomatic ties. Tell us more about this deal, Mustafa, which was signed at the White House.
Omar, last Friday, U.S. President Donald Trump hosted Azerbaijani President Ilham Aliyev and Armenian Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan at the White House, and Aliyev and Pashinyan signed a U.S.-brokered landmark peace deal, and they pledged to cease hostilities, recognize their borders, and establish diplomatic relations between their countries. Both Aliyev and Pashinyan also vowed to recognize their countries' political sovereignty and territorial integrity. As you know, Azerbaijan launched a military campaign against Armenian separatist forces located in Karabakh, and Azerbaijani security forces successfully liberated Karabakh from the Armenian occupation in 2023, and right now they are trying to establish diplomatic ties, and they are set to normalize their bilateral relationships. Personally, I appreciate the peace deal between Azerbaijan and Armenia, but I don't like the venue for the signing of the peace agreement between two nations in the region. As you know, Turkey's diplomatic and military support paved the way for the liberation of the Karabakh from the Armenian occupation. Turkey has been always calling for regional solutions for regional problems. Turkey has been also trying to normalize its bilateral relationships with Armenia. On the other hand, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan hosted Armenian Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan in Istanbul last month to discuss the possible ways to normalize the bilateral ties between Ankara and Yerevan. On the other hand, as you know, one nation, two-state motto is defining the strategic cooperation between Turkey and Azerbaijan. I think that Azerbaijan and Armenia should have signed the peace deal in Turkey, and on the other hand, we know that both Aliyev and Pashinyan are preparing to nominate U.S. President Donald Trump for Nobel Peace Prize. Personally, I think that if someone deserves Nobel Peace Prize for the peace between Azerbaijan and Armenia, I think they should be Turkish decision makers.
Musa, tell us about the new agreement, which includes TRIP. It's called the Trump Route for International Peace and Prosperity. What is this about, Mustafa? I believe this is a corridor where the U.S. will have exclusive rights for up to 99 years, and this is in the transit corridor, the Zangezur corridor. Tell us more about this agreement, Mustafa, this TRIP, which is the Trump Route for International Peace and Prosperity.
Umar, as you know, as Azerbaijan liberated Karabakh from the Armenian occupation, Turkey has been advocating for the Zangezur corridor, and it is expected that this project will bring economic prosperity and political stability to the South Caucasus. On the other hand, we know that Azerbaijan is supporting Turkey's strong support for the development projects in the region. On the other hand, Georgia is also reiterating its strong support for Turkey's diplomatic initiatives in terms of ensuring regional peace and stability in the South Caucasus. As you know, yesterday, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan hosted his Georgian counterpart in the capital Ankara, and they reiterated their country's determination to bring economic prosperity and social welfare to the region. On the other hand, Iran was against the opening of the Zangezur corridor. Within this context, Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan has been engaging with his Iranian counterpart to discuss the possible steps in terms of realizing the Zangezur corridor. But last week, as Armenia and Azerbaijan signed a peace deal, they decided to change the name of Zangezur corridor to the Trump route for international peace and prosperity. I think that the United States will control this corridor for 99 years, and it is clearly showing that Russia's and Iran's geopolitical influence is vanishing in the region, while the United States' influence is rising. As you know, Turkey's foreign ministry issued a written statement about the peace deal between Azerbaijan and Armenia. Foreign ministry reiterated Turkey's strong support for peace, stability, and tranquility in the South Caucasus region. I think that Turkey's diplomatic initiatives and military steps paved the way for the liberation of Karabakh from the Armenian occupation. I think that Turkey will continue to give its strong support for so-called Trump route for international peace and prosperity.
Musa, what are Iran's concerns right now? Why is Iran saying that it will not allow this plan to go ahead? But what's Iran fearing at this point?
Umar, as you know, Iran and Azerbaijan relationships have its ups and downs in the historical process. Sometimes Iran is accusing Azerbaijan of conducting expansionist foreign policy in the region, because we know that in the northern part of the country, ethnic Azerbaijanis are living in Iran, and Iran is afraid of its political sovereignty and territorial integrity. On the other hand, Azerbaijan Azerbaijan reiterates at every opportunity that it is respecting Iran's territorial integrity and political sovereignty. And during the occupation years, we know that Iran supported separatist Armenian forces in the Karabakh, and Azerbaijan has been always calling upon Iran to cooperate with itself to increase peace and stability in the region. As you know, Turkey has been advocating for the Zangezur corridor. Turkish decision makers think that this corridor will bring economic prosperity to the region. But for the geopolitical reasons, Iran is against the opening of the Zangezur corridor. Iran is also citing close relationships between Azerbaijan and Israel. As you know, some Iranian news outlets have been accusing Azerbaijan of letting Israel to launch a strike against Iran's nuclear facilities and military installations. Azerbaijan is rejecting all these allegations. Yes, Azerbaijan has been enjoying close relationships with Israel in many fields, but I don't think that Azerbaijan is targeting Iran's political sovereignty or territorial integrity. For the geopolitical reasons, Iran was against the Zangezur corridor, but right now there is a United States factor in the region. I think that United States will be able to control Iran through Trump route for international peace and prosperity. I think that right now it is up to Turkey to facilitate or mediate talks between Iran and United States. I think that Turkey's diplomatic actions will yield positive results in terms of de-escalating the geopolitical tensions in the South Caucasus.
Mustafa, another reason why these deals are being signed is because the United States wants Russia to leave this region. It does not want the Russian influence in this region, and it has been trying for years to, remove the Russians from this region. When you look at countries like Georgia, Iran, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Russia has had good ties with all of these countries, even Turkey. Now, another meeting, Mustafa, that we're going to see this Friday is between Trump and Putin in Alaska on the 15th of August. What are your expectations from this meeting, Mustafa? Because for now, Zelensky has not been included in these talks, and European leaders have condemned this decision, which was made by Trump when he said he's not going to involve Zelensky in these talks. What do you think are both of these leaders are going to talk about in Alaska? What's on their agenda? Do you think that we are close to a ceasefire in this war, which has continued for over 4 years now?
Well, I think if we want to understand the current planned meeting between Trump and Putin, I think we have to delve into the process. As you know, last year during his presidential campaign, Trump promised to end Ukraine-Russia war within 24 hours, and he started his second presidency in January. But right now we are in August, and we are seeing that on the ground, war between Ukraine and Russia is raging on. On the other hand, as you know, Trump changed its attitude towards the Ukraine-Russia war. Firstly, he was against the military support for Ukraine. He diplomatically humiliated Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in front of the international media. He decided to suspend some military support for Ukraine. But last month, he changed his attitude towards the war between Ukraine and Russia. Trump administration decided to send a Patriot missile defense system to Ukraine with the aim of defending itself against the Russian aggression. Trump also threatened Russia and its allies to impose economic sanctions and to increase trade tariffs. It is clearly showing that Trump right now is pursuing escalation for de-escalation to bring back Vladimir Putin to the negotiating table. And Trump's latest decision, I think, paved the way for the upcoming meeting between two leaders. And Alaska will host both Trump and Putin this Friday. I think Ukraine-Russia war and possible steps will dominate the Trump-Putin meeting. But personally, I don't think that there will be any diplomatic breakthrough from these ceasefire talks, because, as you know, these talks are excluding Ukraine from the negotiating table, we can clearly say that if the international community wants to see the end of the war between Ukraine and Russia, I think all warring sides should sit at the same negotiating table. I don't think that we can see any ceasefire or peace deal from Trump-Putin talks.
Mustafa, tell me about the European concern, because many leaders have urged Trump to include Zelensky in these talks, but Trump is not going to include Zelensky in these talks for the time being, because we still have a day or two till the meeting actually begins in Alaska. Now, Mustafa, what are the issues that Europe's security architecture is going to face at this point, or it has been facing over the past few months? Because European leaders have said that Ukraine could cede its territory to Russia. And this is something that Trump has also mentioned before. He has said that Ukraine must give some territory to Russia, even though that has been occupied by the Russians. And he has said that if Ukraine wants to achieve a ceasefire, it has to cede some territory to the Russians. Now, Mustafa, how is this going to impact Europe's security architecture?
Omar, we know that Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is seeking security assurances from Ukraine's European allies. And we know that France, Germany and United Kingdom have been always reaffirming their strong support for Ukraine's territorial integrity and political sovereignty. On the other hand, Trump's some diplomatic steps raised fears among European allies within the North Atlantic Treaty Organization over the American security commitment to the continent. And as you know, in 2014, Russia annexed Ukraine's Crimea, and no one, including Turkey, is recognizing the illegal annexation of Crimea by the Russian Federation. And according to some American reports, there will be a discussion on territory swap between Ukraine and Russia during Trump-Putin talks. And right now, Europeans think that Trump maybe will consider the recognition of the Crimea by the Russian Federation. And it is clearly raising fears among the European allies. And today, I think European nations gather in Germany to discuss what can be done in terms of ensuring long-standing peace and stability in the old continent. I think that United States diplomatic actions will continue to raise fears among the European allies. On the other hand, Zelensky is strictly against the territory swap between Ukraine and Russia. He is determined to protect Ukraine's territorial integrity and political sovereignty. But on the other hand, American decision makers think that if they want to put an end to the ongoing conflicts, they will be supposed to swap some territories. As you know, Russia is also calling upon Ukraine to give up its territorial integrity and political sovereignty. On the other hand, Ukraine is asking the full withdrawal of Russian military forces from the occupied territories. And these different security demands, I think, need to be reconciled by the regional or international stakeholders. And it is up to Turkey right now to facilitate or mediate talks between Ukraine and Russia.
Mustafa, thanks for that analysis. We'll be right back with you. A rare show of unity emerged in Turkey's parliament as parties rallied behind the government's anti-terror push, advancing plans for a comprehensive strategy to dismantle the PKK and heal the scars of decades-long terrorism.
Türkiye has taken a historic step in its long-standing fight against terrorism, as the newly established parliamentary commission tasked with addressing the disarmament of the PKK terrorist group convened for the third time on Tuesday to continue drafting its roadmap. The commission, which includes representatives from parties in parliament, marks a rare moment of political consensus around one of the country's most sensitive security issues. The move comes amid rising momentum behind the government's Terror-Free Türkiye initiative, which seeks a comprehensive and sustainable solution to the PKK's nearly four-decade terrorism. The Commission's mandate includes drafting legal proposals to support a possible disarmament process, including amendments to Turkey's anti-terror laws and revisions to the law on the execution of penalties. According to sources close to the process, preliminary proposals are expected by October, when Parliament returns from recess.
Terörsüz Türkiye hedefimize mutlaka ulaşarak kahraman şehitlerimizin ve gazilerimizin fedakarlıklarının boşa gitmediğini göstereceğiz.
The Terror-Free Türkiye initiative aims to not only eliminate terrorism but also address the social and economic wounds left by years of conflict. It promotes national unity through dialogue, disarmament, and reforms, especially in regions heavily affected by violence. Officials say the initiative will include measures for reintegration, legal clarity, and regional development. If successful, the plan could mark the beginning of a new era in Türkiye, one that replaces armed conflict with peace, reconciliation, and long-term national strength.
Terörden ilaniyeye kurtulmamız için Türkiye'nin önünde bir fırsat penceresi aralanmıştır. Bunu ziyan etmenin vebali ağır olacaktır. Komisyonun milletimizin beklentilerine uygun şekilde terörsüz Türkiye çabalarının başarısı için üzerine düşeni layıkıyla yapacağına inanıyorum.
Welcome back to the program. Now let's take a look at the top stories from Daily Sabah. Mustafa, as we were just listening from the Turkish president, his plans now are more concrete than ever before because all parties are now on the same page when it comes to fighting PKK's terrorism. Now, the third round of talks was held by the Commission, Mustafa, that has been designed to oversee the disarmament and the dissolution of the PKK terror group. Tell me more about that, Mustafa. Parliament Speaker Numan Kurtulmuş chaired that session. Tell us more about that.
Mar, as you mentioned yesterday, Turkey's Parliament Commission convened for the third time in Turkish capital Ankara to discuss the latest developments over the dissolution of the PKK terror group. And Turkish Parliament Speaker Numan Kurtulmuş chaired the meeting, and he praised the political parties' efforts to lay down the legal framework for the dissolution of the PKK. And it is clearly showing the rare political unity among Turkish political parties, because both ruling AK Party and opposition parties are reiterating their strong support for the Terror-Free Türkiye initiative. As you know, in February, PKK's jailed ringleader Abdullah Öcalan called on the separatist terror group to dissolve itself and lay down the weapons. On the other hand, in May, PKK terror group announced its decision to dissolve itself and lay down the weapons. And in northern Iraq's Süleymaniye province, some PKK terrorists laid down their weapons. And right now, Turkish security forces have been meticulously following the latest development about the PKK's dissolution and disarmament process. On the other hand, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan pledged to realize Terror-Free Türkiye initiative, but I think that Terror-Free Türkiye also means terror-free region, and within this context, Turkey is expecting concrete steps from both Syria and Iraq to secure the borders among these countries, because we know that PKK is not only operating in Turkey, they are also active in northern Iraq and northern Syria. They are also posing huge threat to Syria's and Iraq's territorial integrity and political sovereignty. I think that all regional stakeholders are determined right now to eliminate the PKK terror threat in the region. I think that Terror-Free Türkiye initiatives will also help the government realize a century of Türkiye vision.
Mustafa, also I want to focus on another story, which is US and China have decided to extend their tariffs. Now they've decided to extend it by 90 days, 3 months. Tell us more about that, because at one point we were seeing Trump and the Chinese government fighting against one another, imposing tit-for-tat tariffs. Why now?
Mar, this year we know that US President Donald Trump launched trade wars against dozens of nations, because we know that Trump has been always accusing other countries of taking advantage of the United States. And Trump is primarily targeting China, because it is all because of geopolitical rivalry between the United States and China. And American and Chinese decision makers have been discussing possible steps to deal with their trade problems. And United States and China have recently expanding trade truce for another 90 days. And US President Donald Trump, I think, is set to go to China to meet with his Chinese counterpart Xi Jinping. I think that they will finalize their trade deal during Trump-Xi meeting, but it is all because of geopolitical rivalry between these giant powers. As you know, United States is looking for regional actors to encounter China's rising political influence in the Asia-Pacific region. But on the other hand, Trump is also imposing tariffs and sanctions on Japan and South Korea, because we know that Japan and South Korea will help United States balance China's political rise. But on the other hand, these countries right now are going to China to strike new deal to counter Trump's tariff threats. I think that this trade pause will yield positive results in terms of dealing with the bilateral or multilateral trade disputes among nations.
Mustafa, thanks for that update on the top stories from Daily Sabah.
Thank you, Mar.
Now let's take a look at the top stories from the occupied Gaza Strip, where Israeli killings are ongoing and more journalists have been killed by the Israeli government.
They bear witness the suffering of civilians in the Gaza Strip, and they too suffer the pain of war and displacement. In Gaza, journalists sleep on thin mattresses in stifling heat. They work out of vans or makeshift tents converted into newsrooms. And their days are punctuated by filming ambulances, bringing in casualties of war for triage. Israel's offensive in Gaza, now in its 22nd month, has left much of the territory in ruins. International journalists have been barred from entering Gaza since 2023. So the task of informing the world has fallen to people like Ezzaldin Al-Mazri, a freelance journalist and documentary filmmaker.
A journalist suffers from two missions during displacement. The first mission is that he, as a journalist, is being displaced from one place to another, where some of the logistics for journalistic work are available to him, such as electricity and the internet. However, he also needs to provide for his family, who are also destined for displacement, like the rest of the Palestinian people.
Israel's recent targeted killing of some journalists has also sent a chilling message. On Sunday, an Israeli airstrike killed 6 journalists, including prominent Al Jazeera correspondent Anas al-Sharif, in a tent at Gaza City. The attack was condemned by journalists and rights groups. The Committee to Protect Journalists says at least 186 journalists have been killed in the Gaza conflict. Under a strict Israeli blockade, hunger and starvation also pose a challenge. French news agency Agence France-Presse in late July called on the immediate evacuation of its freelancers and their families. This came after the AFP Journalists Association issued its own statement, saying colleagues in Gaza risked dying of hunger. Al Jazeera correspondent Momen al-Sharafi hopes more can be done for the plight of journalists there.
Our message to the world and the international community is that it is important to put pressure on the Israeli occupation authorities to provide protection for Palestinian journalists.
Israel's offensive in Gaza has killed more than 61,000 Palestinians, according to health officials.
Welcome back to the program. Joining us now from the Turkish capital is Dr. Shuay Nilhan Açıkalın from the Hacı Bayram Veli University. Dr. Shuay, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Umar.
Dr. Shuay, I will start with the killing of journalists in the occupied Gaza Strip. Now, Israel is continuing to kill journalists. A few days ago, we saw 5 more journalists from Al Jazeera who were killed in the occupied Gaza Strips. Palestinians, they've been covering the entire massacres since October 2023. How are you analyzing the killings of these journalists, Shuay?
Thank you very much, Umar. Yes, you mentioned that the 238 journalists was killed by the Israeli, but it's not only after the 7th of October, but also before the 7th of October. In last 50 years, we see clearly that the Israeli government targeted and killed different countries' journalists. And I think it's a systematic policy and the approach that taken by the Israeli government that clearly, consciously try to keep the voices as much as possible from the Gaza, and also they try to suppress the possible media outlets. They're giving the true news to the world, because it's also important, because what we see in the last 1.5 years. Unfortunately, most of the Western media outlets just show the biased stories from the Israeli side or one-sided stories of the Israeli-Palestine conflict in the historical manner. And that kind of the targeting the freelance journalist from the Gaza as a Palestine journalist is also another systemic approach by the Israeli government as a part of their, unfortunately, public policy and also their defense strategy in the Gaza. Unfortunately, this basically the silence from the international community that who represent the journalists in the world and also the other countries make the Israeli much more willingness to kill the journalists in the Gaza, not only in Gaza, but also the other parts of the Palestine, the all journalists, even who is working there as the foreign journalists outside of the country. They threaten the journalists we saw from the Leave program of the Turkish television as well.
Dr. Shwai, in the past few days, we've been seeing that the Israeli government is increasing its plans to fully occupy the Gaza Strip. Now, Netanyahu started by saying that they will start one by one. Firstly, they'll occupy Gaza City, then they'll go to different places, for example, Rafah, Deir al-Balah. But, there's also conflict within the Israeli government. The Israeli cabinet says that Netanyahu should not do it step by step, but he should fully occupy the Gaza Strip in one go. How are you evaluating these decisions by the Israeli government?
You are totally right, Umar. We see the internal debates and the domestic political issues since the 7th of October, actually, because the 2 times since the 7th of October, Netanyahu had to revise the cabinet and he tried to minimize the crackdowns and other voices in his cabinet. But unfortunately, here is the position is not expected the world want to see, but the position is mostly the crackdown and the debates between the Netanyahu and others are basically between the Netanyahu and far right than the Netanyahu, and that is the problem in general sense in the cabinet. So it can be said that although there is a clear divergence and the different opinions regarding the Gaza occupation, Netanyahu tried to keep his power as much as possible to create the violence and continue to this vicious circle for not only in Gaza, but actually in the regional politics as well. Because last year, as we've seen that when the Netanyahu has the cabinet crisis, he clearly attacked Lebanon, and in last 2 months, he clearly attacked Iran when he has the very serious problem faced by the cabinet and their request for the Gaza and the regional politics. And I think in upcoming days, the Netanyahu tried to take the concrete step as much as possible before the UN summit in the September to occupy the Gaza, because most of the countries declare that they will recognize the Palestine in September. So I'm expecting to see that the Netanyahu try to take more radical decisions towards the Gaza and the Palestine policy.
Dr. Shwai, we're talking about the summit, right? The UN General Assembly next month. Do you think that these decisions that are taken by Western countries, for example, Australia, the UK, France, all of them have said that they're going to recognize the state of Palestine. Do you think that this will shift momentum in the favor of the Palestinians? And how will this challenge Israel?
Well, actually, it is a good news in the first sense, but we need to divert the countries in the different categories, because some of the countries, for example, especially in Canada, they have the recognition with some conditions, and these conditions seems to be a little bit suspicious how they basically recognize the Palestine, because most of the countries, when they recognize the Palestine, the position of Hamas, who is elected by the Palestinian people, will be also questioned in their recognition as well. And on the other hand, if you look over some European countries like the France and the UK, they have much more flexible recognition, which is a much more positive way to see a realistic way of the recognition. And in this case, it can be said that it is important to see the September UN Leaders Summit, because these Leaders Summits will be also seen that in which countries seems to be recognized the Palestine as the basement of the two-state solution, because the only way to recognize the Palestine is not the way to solve this problem between the Israel and the Palestine, but also they need to support two-state solution. And at the same time, some countries also mentioned that in their public discussions, redefinition of the Israeli borders. It's also another question mark when it comes to the recognition. So it can be said that these recognition decisions, of course, is the good news to see that the world right now has much more awareness on the Palestine issue. But the point is that there's a still question mark in which sense and how it can be helpful to see the two-state solution.
Dr. Schweib excellently said that the world is now paying more attention to what's going on in the occupied Gaza Strip, but there's still international discrepancy because you've been following all of these wars, these conflicts, not only in this region, but also internationally. And you have also seen that there's so much discrepancy. Not much focus is being given to the war in Gaza. Not much criticism is being implied upon the Israeli government. Because when you look at how the Russia-Ukraine war has continued over the last few years, and when you compare it with the Israel-Hamas war and the Israeli massacres in the occupied Gaza Strip, we can see that there's not much focus on the suffering of the Palestinians. But when we look at the actions taken against Russia, they were sanctioned. The Russian government was sanctioned. Politicians, diplomats were sanctioned. Embargoes were imposed on the Russian government. But we have not seen such kind of an action or actions when it comes to the Israeli government. So why is there this discrepancy? Why is the international community favoring Israel and targeting Russia? Why are we seeing this?
Well, Umar, unfortunately, this is not the new for the Western side. We see the Bosnia, the same situation. But this time we can consider two different reasons. One of them is, of course, geopolitical. I mean, the Russian-Ukrainian war is ongoing in the European continent. So this is one of the cases, of course, most of the European countries focused on their war in their own region. And secondly, there are, of course, some other historical and psychological reason. They have a tendency to ignore what happens to Palestine people, because most of the European countries, leading by the Germany, they have a historical and a psychological setback. They have always feeling that they need to defend Israel's all policies, doesn't matter which they included. And it created a kind of the systemic and the long-term blindness towards the humanitarian conditions in the Palestine. And last one, I think it's also important to say, unfortunately, we see the double-faced and the biased attitude not only in the Palestine, but we have been seen in the Syria and other countries during the Arab Spring as well. Unfortunately, these the universal values like the human rights, democracy, and freedom of speech can be only counted when it comes to their region or their countries or their own people when they consider, but they generally try to be blind towards the other regions when it comes to especially the Middle East, and they try to keep their policy.
I believe we have a connection issue right now. Mustafa, I'll get back to you. Let's talk about Turkey's efforts when it comes to supporting the Palestinian cause. Over the weekend, we saw there was a massive rally in Istanbul supporting the Palestinian cause. And then President Erdogan has also spoken to Mahmoud Abbas. Mustafa, how effective has Turkey's role been in advancing the Palestinian cause, not just regionally, but also globally?
Mar, since the very beginning of the crisis in Gaza, as you know, Turkish decision makers have been trying to increase international awareness about Israel's ethnic cleansing policies and genocidal acts in the region. On the other hand, as you know, Turkey has been always calling for a two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Turkish decision makers have been always advocating for the Palestinian statehood based on the 1967 borders with East Jerusalem as its capital. And it is clearly showing that Turkey's diplomatic efforts is yielding positive results in terms of increasing the awareness about the Palestinian cause among Western countries, because France has already announced its decision to recognize the Palestinian statehood on the sidelines of the United Nations General Assembly meeting in September. On the other hand, British Prime Minister Keir Starmer also announced United Kingdom's intention to recognize the Palestinian rights unless Israel takes concrete steps over ceasefire with Hamas. On the other hand, Canada and Australia are preparing to join these countries in terms of recognizing the Palestinian statehood. Yes, a pro-Palestinian movement is gaining momentum worldwide right now. On the other hand, as you mentioned, Turkish public opinion is also rallying against Israel's ethnic cleansing policies in the Gaza Strip. Over the weekend, thousands of Turkish citizens took to the streets to express their solidarity with the Palestinian people living in the occupied territories. But condemnation and criticism don't yield positive results in terms of ending Israel's military campaign in the region. I think concrete steps will be needed to convince the Israeli decision makers of returning to the negotiating table to strike new ceasefire deal with Hamas. I think that concrete measures can include economic sanctions, arms embargo, and cutting military ties with these countries. As you know, Turkey has already severed its trade activities and trade ties with Israel. Turkey has been always calling for regional cooperation and collaboration in terms of dealing with the security challenges posed by Israel's military campaign in the region. If the regional and international stakeholders want to see peace and stability in the Middle East, I think that they will be supposed to take Turkey's security demands into the consideration. And if the international community takes concrete steps to put an end to Israel's military activities in the region, I think we will be able to see more political stability and economic prosperity in the region. And I think that the long story short, Palestinians deserve to live in their homeland with peace and dignity.
Mustafa, thank you for that analysis and for being in the studio with us on another episode.
Thank you, Mar.
Before I close the program today, I would also like to thank Dr. Shwai Nilhan Achik-Allen. We lost her through a connection issue, but thanks to her, we got to know about the situation in the occupied Gaza Strip. I will see you guys tomorrow. That's the end of our program. Bye for now.